Tonight's sleep story is part one of our two-part journey through the entire history of ancient Egypt, a story that begins not with kings or pyramids, but with water. Before the first stone was raised, a river taught people how to live by its breath, rising and falling, marking the rhythm of time. But how did that rhythm become civilization? How did a single river turn hunters into builders, farmers into astronomers, and memory into myth? From scattered villages to the uniting of the two lands, from mud brick homes to the first pyramids reaching for the sky, these chapters tell how Egypt learned to build not only for life, but for eternity. Tonight, we begin where the river begins, and listen for the moment when history first learned to speak. Good evening, traveller, and welcome to Realm and Reason. If you'd like to drift through more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe before you fall asleep. Now, take a deep breath in and let it go. Before we begin, let's put your body to rest. Start by resting your attention at the top of your head. Notice the sensations, not just the image of the body, but the feeling of it. Slowly move down through your body, spending about 5 seconds on each part. With every exhale, let that area soften. Imagine your breath traveling through each place you focus on, releasing tension as it flows. Keep moving downward through your eyebrows, your cheeks, your neck and shoulders, your hands and fingers, down through your legs to the very tips of your toes. And now, release the whole body. Let yourself drift and rest. Chapter 1. The river begins. From around 7000 to 3100 BCE, the night opens with water. Listen, you can almost hear it. A wide, slow river sighing through darkness, moonlight bending along its surface. On its banks, reeds rustle, and the breath of cattle carries through the air. Somewhere a wooden oar touches water, a soft sound, the rhythm that would outlast empires. Before there were pharaohs or temples, before a single stone was set in the desert, there was this river, the Nile, winding through a landscape that was still learning what it would become. 7,000 years ago, the land we now call Egypt looked nothing like the desert we imagine today. The Sahara was alive then, green and restless. Rain fell where now there is silence. Grasses grew, and antelope, giraffe, and herds of longhorned cattle wandered across broad plains. People followed the herds and the water, hunters and gatherers who knew how to read the horizon by the flight of birds and the taste of the wind. Over centuries the skies changed. The Great Wet Age, the African Humid Period, began to end. Lakes shrank, dunes returned. Families who had lived by the vanishing pools began to drift eastward, toward the one waterway that never failed them. They found the Nile, a narrow corridor of life, a ribbon of green winding north through heat and stone, and they stayed. Each year the river rose, swollen by rains far away in the Ethiopian highlands. It spread across the valley floor, covering the fields with dark, silky mud. When the waters withdrew, they left behind the richest soil in the world. That black earth, the alluvium, the fine fertile silt, became Egypt's inheritance. The people called their land Kemet, the Black Land, for that gift of soil set against the Deshret, the Red Land, the empty desert on either side. Here the first farmers learned the rhythm that would shape Egyptian time forever: flood, planting, harvest, rest. It was not a calendar written on papyrus, but one marked in water and mud. The river became a metronome, and its beat taught order to those who lived by it. Small villages rose on the river's edge, built just high enough to stay above the floods. They were made of mud brick, clay shaped by hand, dried in the sun, light enough to rebuild when the water took them. Families stored grain in rounded silos, kept goats and cattle in woven pens, and cooked in open courtyards where smoke curled up into the evening air. In the quiet after sunset, you might hear the low music of flutes, the murmur of neighbours trading stories, the distant cry of birds nesting in the reeds. The Nile was not only food and drink, it was sound, motion, and memory. The earliest people we know by name, or rather by the names archaeologists have given them, were the Badarians. They lived along the Middle Nile about 6,000 years ago, farming the floodplain and shaping the first fine pottery of Egypt. Red vessels with darkened rims, polished until they gleamed like wet stone. Their craftsmanship was astonishingly delicate, thin as an eggshell, formed without the potter's wheel, only by touch and patience. The Badarians buried their dead carefully, facing west toward the setting sun, the direction of the next world, wrapped in linen, surrounded by offerings of food and small trinkets of ivory or shell. In those graves we see something new, not just survival but tenderness, an idea that the person might continue beyond death. To the north and south, cultures grew and mingled, blending into what we now call Naqada, a name borrowed from a place near the river, but really it means an age of transformation. Over many centuries, Naqada first, second and third, Egypt changed from a cluster of river villages into a network of chiefdoms linked by trade and ritual. The Naqada potters painted their jars with images of boats, animals, and the sun. The boats curve high at the prow and stern, almost like crescent moons. These were not warships, nor yet the grand barges of the pharaohs, but light vessels made of papyrus reeds tied in bundles. They carried fishers and families, traders and priests. They were Egypt's first highways. When you hear the word basin, think of the river's gentle hand at work. Low earthen embankments forming pockets that caught the flood, holding the water long enough for the soil to drink. It was the earliest form of basin irrigation, a way of guiding, not forcing, the Nile. People read the water like a script. Where it pooled, they planted. Where it vanished, they built. The land and the river learned each other's language. As trade blossomed, copper arrived from Sinai, obsidian from Ethiopia, cedar wood from Lebanon. These were more than luxury goods. They were signs of connection, proof that Egypt's long body of river and desert was joining the wider world. And with trade came something else: hierarchy. In the richest graves we find stone vases carved thin as light, ivory combs, lapis amulets, cosmetics ground on slate palettes. One person had more than another, and the idea of a leader began to take root. The symbols of power, standards topped with falcons, bulls, or mythical creatures, began to appear in processions painted on pottery. Rock carvings, called petroglyphs, show boats drawn across the cliffs near Hierakonpolis, sometimes with a tall figure standing alone under a canopy, holding a staff or mace. We can imagine, though we cannot prove, that these were early rulers, chiefs who controlled stretches of the river, each with their own emblem, their own god, their own following. By this time the desert had hardened, and the Nile Valley was thick with life. The river no longer simply fed, it organised. Every year the flood came from the south and moved north like a slow heartbeat. To predict it was to hold power. Those who understood its rhythm could plan the sowing and the harvest. They became the keepers of balance, what later Egyptians would call Mahat, the harmony between heaven, earth, and humankind. The Naqada people built houses of wattle and clay, simple but ordered. Their settlements had central spaces where craftspeople worked copper and stone, and storage areas where grain was measured and sealed. Those seals, small lumps of clay pressed with carved designs, were the ancestors of administration. Each imprint carried identity and responsibility. It was a small step from a seal to a sign, and from a sign to writing. In the desert cliffs west of the river, graves grew larger and more elaborate. The dead were buried with models of tools, food and ornaments, a practice that would later expand into the grand tombs of pharaohs. Already we see the outline of an idea that would define Egyptian thought for millennia, that life continues, and that preparation for it must be precise. The late Naqada period, sometimes called proto-dynastic Egypt, is the threshold where myth and history begin to meet. Pottery workshops became state industries. Towns such as Hierakonpolis and Abydos rose as centres of ceremony and power. We find stone palettes carved with scenes of conquest, men, animals, standards, and the falcon of Horus hovering above. The Narmer palette, created perhaps just before 3100 BCE, shows a ruler striking down an enemy, wearing both the white crown of the south and the red crown of the north. Whether or not this scene records a literal event, it tells us the story Egyptians would forever believe, that one king favoured by the gods united the two lands into one. But before Narmer, another name whispers from the sand, Scorpion, an early ruler whose signs appear on ceremonial maces and jar labels. His emblem, a small scorpion carved beside a rosette, marked goods that travelled along the river. In his tomb at Abydos, archaeologists found hundreds of tiny bone and ivory tags. On each, a few small pictures, a bird, a mountain, a vessel, scratched with a sharpened reed. They were the earliest hieroglyphs, not yet full sentences, but labels of ownership, shipments and tribute. Writing at its birth was not for poetry but for counting, for the quiet bureaucracy of civilization. The people who made those marks could not have known how long their language would last, or how it would one day fill the walls of temples and tombs with hymns and prayers. They were simply keeping track, jars of wine, sacks of grain, the yield of the flood. But from their lists grew the written soul of Egypt. By the end of this age, around 3100 BCE, Egypt was already Egypt in miniature. The outlines of its future were all there. Divine kingship, the faith in life after death, the partnership between order and river, desert and star. The great stone temples and pyramids were still centuries away, but the thinking that would build them had already begun, the sense that eternity could be measured, counted, and shaped. Imagine now the scene at dusk on that ancient floodplain. The water has fallen, the fields shimmer with new shoots. Villagers walk home along narrow ridges of mud, baskets balanced on their shoulders. Smoke drifts from cooking fires. Somewhere a dog barks. Across the river the desert glows red, then violet, then dark. The Nile slides northward, carrying silt, seeds and stories. In its reflection the first stars of evening appear. Each one will have a name soon enough. Each one will mean something to someone watching from the shore, wondering how long the river has been here and how long it will remain. Long before the pyramids touched the sky, before names were carved in stone, Egypt's history was already flowing, quiet, steady, eternal, between the banks of the river that began it all. Chapter 2. Two Lands, One Crown. Around 3100 to 2686 BCE. The Nile has always been a story told in two voices. One speaks from the narrow valley of the south, where cliffs rise sheer and golden in the morning light. The other from the wide delta of the north, where the river slows and scatters into green threads that weave toward the sea. These were once two lands, Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north, each distinct in landscape and spirit. The south was austere and sun-blazed, its people living between walls of stone. The north was lush and humid, its marshes alive with ibis calls and the hum of insects. Their difference was more than geography. It was rhythm, light, and the way people understood time itself. In Upper Egypt, the river felt swift and muscular, pressing north through the cliffs. In the delta, it felt patient, spreading outward like an open hand. Yet both worlds shared the same heartbeat, the flood. Every summer the Nile rose, covering the fields, and both lands waited together for its return. For centuries these two regions were home to independent kingdoms ruled by local chieftains. They traded, they quarrelled, they sometimes fought. But trade brought familiarity, and familiarity bred ambition. Caravans of gold from the south, copper from the Sinai, and cedar from the Levant began to move along the same watery highway. Gradually, through commerce, marriage, and rivalry, the pieces of a single nation began to form. To the Egyptians, unity was not merely political, it was cosmic. The river itself seemed to call for it. Archaeology points to a ruler, often named Narmer, who is credited with wearing both crowns and may have been instrumental in uniting the two lands. The white crown of Upper Egypt, called the headjet, was tall and smooth, shaped like a sprouting lily. It stood for purity and the strength of the southern highlands. The red crown of Lower Egypt, the deshret, was broad and flaring, with a curling wire like a cobra's tongue at the front, a symbol of vigilance and sovereignty. When a king placed both upon his head, they became the shent, the double crown. Two lands joined, two voices singing the same song. The name Narmer endures largely because of the Narmer palette, carved from dark green siltstone. On it, the king appears twice, once wearing the white crown, once the red. The palette, likely a ceremonial object used for mixing pigments, depicts him towering over enemies while beside him the falcon god Horus holds the symbol of the conquered delta. Around them, attendants carry banners topped with animal emblems, the early standards of local gods and provinces. We can't know whether these carvings record a single act of conquest or a symbolic merging of cultures. Based on what we know, this could imply a long process of gradual unification rather than one decisive victory, a weaving together through trade, diplomacy, and shared belief. Whatever the details, by around 3100 BC, Egypt stood under one rule, the first territorial state in recorded history stretching from the cataracts of the south to the shores of the Mediterranean. To hold such a long, narrow kingdom, the new ruler needed a centre that joined both regions, a bridge between valley and delta. Around the early First Dynasty, the city of Memphis emerged at the place where Upper Egypt opened into Lower Egypt. Known in Egyptian as Ineb Hedge, the White Walls, it became a natural capital. The location was perfect, above the floodplain but close enough to command it. From Memphis, boats could travel south to the quarries of Aswan or north to the sea. It became the first enduring capital of Egypt, a city built for administration, ceremony, and continuity. In courtyards of mud brick and plaster, officials received harvests as taxes, stored grain in silos, and redistributed it to workers and temples. Early evidence suggests the beginnings of official record-keeping. Seals, labels, and bullae, small lumps of clay stamped with emblems of authority. Scribes trained in writing tallied grain and livestock on papyrus scrolls. Writing, once limited to marking goods and offerings, now carried the pulse of government itself. It's easy to picture one of these scribes at his work, sitting cross-legged in a shaded room, a roll of papyrus before him, a palette of black and red ink at his side. His brush moves quickly as he notes the yield from each field, the weight of copper, the number of workers assigned to a quarry. When he finishes, he rolls the sheet, seals it with clay, and presses the impression of the king's name. That mark, the seal, means truth and accountability. In a world that still had no coinage, trust was made visible in clay. Through this growing system of record and redistribution, a recognizable state economy took shape. Villages sent part of their produce to Memphis, and in return the crown oversaw irrigation, temple upkeep, and defense. It was a cycle of obligation and faith, a river of goods mirroring the Nile's own. To secure that bounty, the new rulers turned attention to water. Egypt's earliest engineers, farmers, labourers, and overseers guided by the king's decree, built embankments, ridges of earth to hold the flood, and dug basins to store it. These works were primitive compared with later canals, yet remarkably effective. They allowed the river's overflow to irrigate the land in controlled rhythm. Priests and surveyors read the Nile like a sacred text, descending stairways called nilometers to measure the water's height against carved marks. A high flood meant abundance, too low and hunger loomed. These measurements were not only practical but spiritual, interpreted as signs of divine favour or warning. Managing the flood meant managing the relationship between gods and people. The principle underlying this harmony would one day be called Mahat, truth, order, and balance. By this time the seeds of what later Egyptians called Mahat were already present. It described not only justice among humans, but the right arrangement of the cosmos. The king's task was to sustain that balance. When he offered incense at sunrise or decreed laws in his court, he was doing more than ruling. He was reenacting creation, keeping the world from slipping into chaos. If the floods failed or famine struck, People saw it as the world losing its balance. Thus, kingship became both political duty and divine stewardship. The pharaoh's role as guardian of Maat gave rise to the concept of divine kingship. The ruler was seen as the living Horus, the falcon god watching from the sky, and at death he became Osiris, lord of renewal. Based on inscriptions and later traditions, we can assume that even at this early stage, kingship carried sacred weight, the idea that order itself had a human face. Memphis thrived under this system. Its docks filled with boats, its workshops rang with the strike of copper chisels, and the scent of baking bread and brewing beer drifted through its streets. We can imagine the bustle at dawn, merchants unloading jars of oil, scribes calling out tallies, priests sprinkling water to bless the day's work. By midday, the heat shimmered, and the city fell into a slow rhythm. Then, as dusk cooled the air, torches flickered to life and harp music flowed from the palace halls. Each movement, the counting of grain, the lighting of lamps, the singing of hymns, was seen as a reflection of Maat, a small act of keeping the world in tune. When society functioned smoothly, Egyptians believed the cosmos itself was aligned. Temples appeared along the river's length, at first built from wood and reed, but later in stone, the material of eternity. Within these sacred enclosures, priests tended shrines to the gods and to the spirits of departed rulers. Offerings of bread, beer, and incense renewed the bond between heaven and earth. The decision to use stone was more than practical, it was philosophical. Stone endured, and endurance was the closest thing to eternity mortals could achieve. Near the capital, great cemeteries expanded. At Saqqara and Abydos, nobles built rectangular tombs called mastaba, flat-roofed monuments with burial chambers beneath. Inside lay bodies carefully wrapped and accompanied by food, pottery, tools, and jewelry.
The Egyptians already believed that the Ka,
the vital spirit, continued beyond death and needed nourishment. Death was seen not as an ending, but a crossing. From this belief grew the ancestor cult, a reverence for past rulers that blended devotion and politics. Each new king maintained the tombs of his predecessors, reaffirming his place in the unbroken chain of Maat. Based on the evidence from inscriptions and offerings, we can assume that caring for the dead was both piety and proof of legitimacy. Over time, kingship deepened into myth. The living pharaoh embodied Horus, the deceased became Osiris. The transfer of power reenacted the eternal cycle of life and death. These ideas may have developed gradually, but the seeds are already visible here in the rituals of the first and second dynasties. Court life reflected this sacred worldview. Officials wore crisp white linen as symbols of purity, and priests shaved their heads to remain ritually clean. Scribes carried palettes of black and red ink. Perfumed smoke from burning myrrh filled the air at dawn. Even simple acts, pouring water, writing a decree, were gestures of harmony. The ordinary became sacred through intention. Beyond the palace, the state's machinery spread along the river. Governors oversaw regional districts. Messengers carried orders on papyrus scrolls sealed with clay. Craftsmen produced standardized weights and measures, ensuring fairness in trade. These traces, found on artifacts and tablets, suggest a surprisingly sophisticated administration for such an early age. It's easy to picture Memphis in motion, barges arriving from the south heavy with stone, others from the north laden with grain, workers unloading baskets, priests blessing the cargo, a scribe calling out numbers to his assistant. The entire scene unfolds with calm precision. This is Mahat in motion, not an abstract ideal but a lived rhythm of work and worship. By the close of the early dynastic period, Egypt had become something new in the human story, a unified nation sustained by law, faith, and the river's eternal pulse. Almost every feature of later Egyptian civilization was already present. The pharaoh as divine mediator, the temple as the heart of community, the scribe as keeper of truth, the tomb as promise of eternity. Even the emblems of rulership, the crook and flail, had appeared. The crook, shaped like a shepherd's staff, symbolized care and protection. The flail, once used to thresh grain, meant fertility and discipline. Together they embodied the ruler's balance to nourish and to command. By about 2668 BCE, 2 dynasties had passed, leaving behind tombs, seals, and inscriptions that speak of confidence and complexity. Memphis gleamed in the sun, its walls whitewashed and its courtyards busy with artisans. South of the city, at Sahara, new tombs grew larger and more elaborate, their walls painted with scenes of harvest and offering. Egypt was ready to build not only for the living but for eternity. Soon a king named Djoser, guided by his brilliant architect Imhotep, would attempt the unimaginable, a tomb of solid stone rising like a staircase to the sky, the first pyramid. For now the Nile glides northward under the moon, its waters whispering along the banks. In the quiet fields, farmers sleep beside their stored grain. In Memphis, a scribe seals his final record and sets down his pen. The river moves on, patient and eternal, carrying with it the memory of the 2 lands now joined beneath one crown. Chapter 3: Stone Awakens. Around 2686 to 2625 BCE, the desert dawn opens in a pale gold hush. A thin mist rises where the fertile valley meets the sand, softening the edge between green and ochre. We can imagine the first workmen arriving at Sahara, a plateau of limestone overlooking the new capital, Memphis. They come in small groups, wrapped in linen skirts against the cool morning, copper chisels and dolerite hammers tied to their belts. Some carry baskets of barley or bread for the day. Ahead of them lies the king's vision, Djoser of Egypt's 3rd dynasty, and a tomb that will change the language of stone forever. Before this time, the royal dead were laid to rest in mastabas, flat-topped mud-brick tombs shaped like broad benches. The word mastab much later meant bench in Arabic, an echo of those low-sloped walls. These tombs were practical, familiar, but fragile. Sun, wind, and flood slowly softened them back into earth. Now, Djoser's builders faced a radical command: to take what had always been built from clay and recreate it in stone, a material that would not melt away with the seasons. The man credited with guiding this transformation was Imhotep, Djoser's high priest, chief architect and advisor. In later centuries he would be worshipped as a god of wisdom and healing, but here he was simply a man with an idea and extraordinary confidence. Archaeology shows that under his design the familiar mastaba form was enlarged, rebuilt in stone, then repeated upward, 6 layers stacked like steps ascending toward the sun. This was the Step Pyramid, the world's first monumental structure of cut limestone. It's easy to picture the quarrying in progress. At dawn, dust hangs in the air as teams strike the limestone with rounded dolerite pounders, dense black stones harder than the rock they split. They cut narrow channels around each block, inserted wooden wedges and soaked them with water. As the wood swelled, the rock cracked free with a muted groan. Once shaped, the blocks were loaded onto wooden sledges and dragged toward the growing pyramid. The sand beneath them was dampened with water, an ancient trick to reduce friction, while foremen shouted rhythm in time to the pull. A single block might weigh 2 tons. Hundreds were needed each day. The site itself was a world in motion. Overseers keeping tallies on scraps of limestone, priests blessing each foundation trench with natron and incense, and young runners carrying messages between the quarries and the workshops. This was not mere labour, it was orchestration on a scale humanity had barely attempted. The step pyramid's surrounding walls stretched nearly a kilometre, and rose about 11 metres high, its surface carved with deep niches that caught the sun in alternating light and shadow. From a distance the enclosure gleamed white, almost otherworldly. Some scholars think its design echoed the royal palace, a symbolic reminder that even in death the pharaoh continued to rule. Based on what we know, the layout may have been intended as an eternal court, a mirror of earthly authority within the landscape of the gods. The pyramid's height, around 60 metres, was astonishing. Each step represented a former mastaba tier, and together they formed what could be read as a stairway to the heavens. The structure may also have evoked the primeval mound, the sacred hill that, according to Egyptian creation myth, first rose from the waters of chaos at the dawn of time. To climb upward was to return to that first act of emergence, renewing creation through stone. Beneath this gleaming monument lay another marvel, a labyrinth of corridors and chambers cut deep into bedrock. Some extend for more than a kilometre, an underground palace for the dead. The walls of the king's burial suite were inlaid with glazed blue tiles, an imitation of the reed matting that lined royal apartments. Based on what we know, this design could imply that Djoser's tomb was meant as a perfect replica of his living palace, a continuation rather than a departure. Death to the Egyptians was not an ending but a transformation, and architecture became the vessel for that belief. Imhotep's experiments reached every part of the complex. Along the outer courts he built colonnades, rows of stone pillars shaped to resemble bundled reeds. These columns, carved entirely from limestone, were fixed to sidewalls for stability. Freestanding columns would come later. The stone captured the texture of the plant world, translating soft organic forms into permanence. In these spaces, courtiers and priests walked through halls of light and shadow, their footsteps echoing softly off the limestone. The boundary between the natural and the man-made blurred. The temple became a petrified garden. Within the enclosure were dummy chapels, symbolic buildings representing Egypt's many shrines, and broad courtyards used for ritual festivals. Among them was the Hebsed court, the setting for the royal renewal rite in which the pharaoh, after 30 years of rule, ritually ran between markers to prove his strength. Whether Djoser performed this ceremony in life or intended it for the afterlife, the architecture itself was ready, perpetually prepared for the king's rebirth. The practical work behind such grandeur relied on astonishing precision. Surveyors, guided by the stars or by the rising sun, aligned the pyramid's sides almost exactly with the cardinal points of the compass. To find true north, they may have used sighting rods and a plumb line, a weighted cord that hung straight to mark vertical alignment. Measuring cords, knotted at regular intervals, ensured proportion. Nothing was arbitrary. Each angle, each block, each course of stone was set according to rule. The Egyptians called this system stretching the cord, a ceremony linking architecture to cosmic order. Ramps of earth and rubble were built to haul the stones upward, though the exact arrangement remains debated. Some archaeologists propose a straight ramp rising from the desert floor. Others suggest a spiraling path that wrapped around the structure as it climbed. Based on the evidence, both methods may have been used at different stages. What matters is that these builders, working with hand tools and muscle, achieved tolerances within a fraction of a degree, an accuracy still admired today. Life on the work site was highly organized. Skilled masons shaped the blocks. Teams of haulers moved them into place. Craftsmen polished faces smooth with sand and grit. Each group worked under an overseer who reported to the royal administration. Scribes recorded daily output, while quartermasters distributed rations: bread, dried fish, onions, and thick beer brewed from barley. That beer, cloudy and nourishing, was part of the wage itself, fueling bodies under the sun. Nearby, women and older men baked, mended, and tended small shrines for protection. Even the supply lines, boats ferrying grain, livestock, and stone, became part of the state's heartbeat. The labourers likely lived in temporary villages along the edge of the plateau, simple clusters of huts where fires glowed at night and songs rose to the rhythm of the river wind. The scent of yeast and roasting grain drifted through the camp, mingling with the dry smell of dust and sweat. For them, this was both work and devotion. To raise the king's tomb was to earn a place within the story of eternity. Imhotep's design united technique and theology. Every stone served a purpose in both realms. The enclosure wall defined sacred space, the triumph of order over chaos. The pyramid's upward thrust represented resurrection. The underground chambers embodied the mystery of rebirth beneath the earth. Even the use of limestone carried meaning. Quarried from the desert's edge, it was a substance born from ancient seas, linking life, death, and time itself. Of course, such innovation carried risk. No one had yet learned exactly how stone bore weight over open spans. Some ceilings cracked, some corridors had to be reinforced, but each challenge refined the builder's understanding. Here, the Egyptians discovered how to make stonework like timber, how to build, not just pile. The lessons learned at Saqqara would shape every monument that followed. By the time Djoser was laid to rest beneath his step pyramid, the plateau had become a city of the dead. Priests performed daily rites, pouring water over altars to nourish the king's spirit. Offerings of food and incense filled the air. From Memphis, the gleam of the white walls could be seen for miles, glowing in the setting sun like frozen light. Travellers who approached along the river must have felt awe. It was as though the desert itself had learned to stand upright. This was more than a tomb. It was a manifesto written in stone, a declaration that human hands could imitate creation. Through Djoser and Imhotep, Egypt had proven that time could be captured, shaped, and made to last. The techniques born here, quarrying, hauling, measuring, aligning, organizing labor and resources, became the template for the age to come. Every later pyramid, every temple, every stone colonnade would trace its lineage back to this plateau. As twilight falls, imagine the air cooling, the last hammer blows fading. A single mason lingers, brushing dust from the block he has just set. Above him rises the first pyramid, its steps climbing into the dusk. He looks up, sees the shadow stretch across the sand, and senses that what they have built will outlive them all. The stone awakens, and with it Egypt enters its first golden age. Chapter 4, Learning to Aim for the Sun. Around 2625 to 2500 BCE, the step pyramid at Saqqara was the spark. From that light rose an age that would lift stone higher than anyone thought possible. Egypt entered a century of experiment, an age of risk, revision, and quiet genius, under a king named Sneferu, founder of the fourth dynasty. His reign marks the moment when architecture turned from innovation to perfection. Sneferu inherited both ambition and uncertainty. His predecessors' stone experiments had shown what was possible, but also what could fail. What came next was something like an ancient form of research and development. 3 grand attempts to refine the pyramid form until it reached flawless geometry. The first stood at Maydam, on the edge of the desert south of Saqqara. It began as another step pyramid, but Sneferu ordered its steps filled in to create smooth sides. Workers packed the spaces between terraces with limestone rubble and laid a gleaming outer casing. The intention was revolutionary. A true pyramid, not a stairway but a single continuous slope rising to the sky. Yet sometime after its completion, the outer shell collapsed, perhaps during construction, perhaps centuries later. Today, it stands stripped to its stepped core, an accidental cross-section of ancient trial and error. Based on what we know from the structure's remains, this collapse may have taught Sneferu's architects that internal angles and foundation quality were critical for stability. Unshaken, the king moved his project north to Dashur, where he began again on a grander scale. This new pyramid rose steeply, at about 54 degrees, but as it climbed, cracks appeared within its internal chambers. To prevent disaster, builders abruptly changed the slope midway to a gentler 43 degrees. The result was a curious shape, the bent pyramid, its upper half appearing to bow inward like a folded wing. To the modern eye it looks accidental, but it also marks the birth of adaptability in ancient engineering. The interior of the bent pyramid introduced another breakthrough: the use of large corbelled chambers, spaces roofed by stacking layers of stone slightly inward, one over another, until they met in an arch-like point. The design disperses weight outward instead of straight down, allowing larger open spaces inside. This technique, born from necessity, would soon become a defining feature of Egypt's greatest monuments. Just a short distance away, Sneferu made a third attempt. His builders refined their measurements, thickened the foundation, and maintained a single, precise slope. This time the design held. The result? The red pyramid, named for the pink hue of its limestone, became Egypt's first successful smooth-sided pyramid and the prototype for all to follow. Rising 105 meters above the desert, it represented mastery through iteration. Its angle, about 43 degrees, would set the standard for centuries. When its white casing stones were new, they reflected sunlight like a mirror. Travellers could see it gleam from miles away. Inside, the chambers of the Red Pyramid still bear the scent of stone dust and the marks of copper chisels. You can almost hear the echo of those who cut and set its blocks, more than 2 million of them. Each weighs between 2 and 15 tons. Ramps of mud brick and rubble allowed teams to drag them upward. No pulleys, no wheels, only human coordination. From Sneferu's 3 pyramids we glimpse an entire philosophy of learning. Each project refining, correcting, perfecting. Together they mark the moment Egypt discovered its most enduring symbol. Not just of power, but of balance, precision, and faith in human hands. When Sneferu died, he left behind both the blueprint and the momentum for something even greater. His son Khufu, known later by the Greek form Cheops, took the throne around 2550 BCE. Within decades he would commission the largest building of the ancient world, the Great Pyramid of Giza. The site itself, Giza, was carefully chosen. It lay on the plateau west of the Nile, where the bedrock was strong and close to the surface, ideal for supporting millions of tons of stone. The project scale defies simple numbers. About 2.3 million blocks, each averaging 2.5 tons, assembled into a structure rising nearly 147 meters high. Even today, the joints between many blocks are so fine you can't fit a blade between them. To orient such a massive square precisely, the builders likely used the stars. The north-south axis aligns almost perfectly with the true north. Archaeologists suggest they sighted along the circumpolar stars, the ones that never set, tracing their crossing points to mark alignment. Each corner rests on a foundation levelled within a fraction of an inch, achieved using channels of water to detect the slightest slope. This subtle method, hydroleveling, using water's natural tendency to find a perfect plane, was simple yet exact. The Great Pyramid's internal structure reveals a deep understanding of stress and weight. Its central corridors rise through massive layers of masonry, while above the burial chamber 5 stacked spates, called relieving chambers, redirect pressure away from the ceiling. Corbelling culminates in the Grand Gallery, the immense sloping passageway where stones are stacked slightly inward, layer by layer, creating that striking vaulted effect. The king's chamber itself is protected by those 5 relieving chambers above, which shunt the load away from its flat granite ceiling. The topmost relieving space is capped by a pair of great granite beams, forming a gabled roof that disperses pressure outward. Everything about the design suggests calculation and foresight, an understanding of how stone could bear not just mass, but intention. The outer surface was once sheathed in white Tura limestone, polished smooth until it shone like glass. Under the desert sun, the pyramid would have gleamed brilliant white, its apex catching the first light of dawn. At sunset, the casing glowed gold, earning it the ancient name Ichet, meaning the glorious light. Over millennia, most of that outer layer was quarried away, leaving the rougher core that remains. The exact design of the construction ramps remains uncertain, and several theories coexist. Some imagine a straight ramp running from the plateau up one face of the pyramid. Others propose a ramp spiraling around the structure, or a combination of both. Evidence from unfinished pyramids suggests ramps of compacted earth and limestone chips, reinforced with timbers. Water poured ahead of sledges reduced friction, allowing teams to drag stones more efficiently. Based on surviving depictions in tombs, this could imply that the Egyptians combined practical ingenuity with experimentation, adapting their approach as the pyramid rose. Yet the building of Giza was more than a technical feat, it was a social one. At the base of the plateau stood the workers' settlement of Hayt el Ghurab, sometimes called the lost city of the pyramid builders. Excavations reveal rows of long barracks-like houses, bakeries, breweries, storage yards, and workshops, a planned community for thousands. These were not slaves in chains, but skilled labourers, stonemasons, and support crews. They worked in rotating teams, likely serving for months at a time as a form of national service and pride. The remains of food tell a vivid story. Animal bones show diets rich in beef, goat, and fish. Grinding stones reveal steady production of bread and beer. These rations were generous, fuel for harder work in desert heat. In nearby dumps, archaeologists have found fragments of medical tools and evidence of healed fractures, suggesting organised healthcare. Workers were treated when injured and returned to duty, an early glimpse of industrial welfare. Imagine the rhythm of their lives. Sunrise over the river, the low chant of haulers on the ramp, the clink of copper chisels and the smell of warm bread drifting from the bakeries. At dusk, they rest in the cool of stone courtyards, drinking thick beer, sharing stories. Pride, fatigue, camaraderie. These were the human threads within the geometry of eternity. Beneath all this labour lay a greater purpose, the merging of engineering and cosmology. To the Egyptians, the pyramid was not only a tomb but a cosmic instrument. Its four sides faced the cardinal directions, grounding it in the order of the universe. Its shape echoed the rays of the sun descending to earth. In hieroglyphs, the pyramid's point was called the Ben-Ben, the first mound of creation on which the sun god Ra rose at the dawn of time. Building in this form was an act of renewal, to raise the pharaoh's body toward the light and ensure his rebirth with the sun each day. Inside the Great Pyramid, two narrow shafts rise from the king's chamber toward the sky. Some believe they served as ventilation, but others note their alignment with key stars, one pointing roughly toward Orion's belt, associated with Osiris, god of the afterlife, the other toward the northern circumpolar stars, the imperishables, which never set. Based on these alignments, it's reasonable to assume the shafts symbolize the pharaoh's ascent, his soul or ka, travelling heavenwards to join the gods. Even the name of Khufu's pyramid complex, Akhet Khufu meaning horizon of Khufu, reflects this celestial thinking. The horizon where sky meets earth was viewed as a gateway between worlds. In stone, the king created his own horizon, a monument both physical and metaphysical, standing precisely at the point where earth greets the sun. By the close of the 4th dynasty, Egypt had perfected its art of aiming for the sun. Snefru had taught the nation how to build. Khufu showed it how to dream. The geometry, the astronomy, the logistics, and the labour all came together in perfect harmony. Each block placed on the plateau carried not just weight but meaning, the embodiment of Mahat, the balance between human order and cosmic law. Even now, when evening shadows stretch across Giza and the air cools to violet, the pyramids hold their stillness. They seem almost to breathe, stone filled with memory, geometry filled with faith. What began as experiment ended as revelation. The moment humanity learned to lift its eyes and aim for the sun. Chapter 5: When the River Falters. Around 2181 to 1650 BCE, night settles over the valley with a quieter kind of darkness. The Nile glides on, but the rhythm it once kept, flood, sowing, harvest, has slipped out of tune. In some years the river rises too little, and fields crack with thirst. In others, water comes late and thin, and grain yields fall short of the jars they were meant to fill. People speak of low floods, scribes mark short rations. We're entering the first intermediate period, a time when power loosens from the centre and settles in many hands at once. Villages lean on themselves, a local head man, what later texts call a nomarch. That's a provincial governor responsible for one nome or district, organises repairs to dikes and canals after a poor inundation, the annual flood that sets the farming calendar. Storehouse doors open one notch at a time because granary, that's the state's pantry of grain, now feels like a lifeline more than a ledger. Small shrines glow at dusk, families leave bread and beer for guardian gods and ancestors, asking for protection and steady water. Coffins begin to carry more writing inside. What modern scholars call the coffin texts, spells meant to guide ordinary people in the afterlife. Based on what we know from these inscriptions spreading beyond royal tombs, we can assume belief itself is widening. Immortality is no longer a palace privilege, but something a farmer can hope to navigate with the right words. Politics splinters into regions. In the north at Heracleopolis, kings claim legitimacy. In the south, Theban rulers of the Intef line do the same. Messages move with the river's current and with caravans on dusty roads through wadies. Those are dry valleys that turn to waterways in sudden rain. There are skirmishes, seized storehouses, and border markers. Stelae, stone slabs cut with names and boasts, set into the ground like loud-throated thorns. And yet life persists. Potters fire red-brown jars, masons carve local tombs with scenes of herds and harvests that feel tender and close. Resilience becomes a craft. From Thebes comes a ruler who will pull the strands together. Mentuhotep II, throne name Nebhepetra, an 11th dynasty king whose court stands in the shadow of the western cliffs. Fights, bargains, and eventually reunites the two lands around 2055 BCE. His mortuary complex at Deir el-Bahri rises like terraces of sunrise against the rock, an early vision on the same bay that centuries later will hold the elegant temple of Hatshepsut. Soldiers lay down spears, tax boats move with purpose again. The very word for balance, mahat, truth, order, right measure, returns to everyday speech like a familiar greeting. What follows is a quieter brilliance, the Middle Kingdom. Scribes copy and create stories that sound like human voices thinking out loud. The tale of Sinuhe travels with a courtier who flees Egypt in fear and longs his way home. The eloquent peasant argues for justice in sentences that glide and sting. as if law and poetry learned to share a mouth. Royal advice literature, the instructions attributed to kings, turns the throne into a schoolroom. Be steady, be vigilant, remember the poor. We can imagine readings by lamplight in a scribe's house near the river, reed pens ticking softly across smoothed pottery shards and fine papyrus. The state is confident enough, again, to be reflective. Strength arrives wearing thought. Administration tightens without becoming cruel. You hear it in the soft clatter of counting, ceilings pressed into wet clay, tallies of cattle, lists of bread loaves, jars of oil, bolts of linen, a nilometer. That's a carved stairway with marks for water height. Lets officials translate the flood into numbers, then numbers into taxes. The idea is simple. When the river is generous, the granaries can be two. When it is meagre, the state smooths the rough edges so villages don't break. Based on restored records and provincial tomb biographies, we can assume many Noe marks now work with the crown rather than beside it. Local pride remains, but it bends toward national order. Into this steaded country steps a stern and gifted monarch, Senwosret III, also spelled Sesostris III, who reigns in the late 12th dynasty. His portraits are unlike the ageless masks of earlier kings. The eyes, deep set, the mouth firm, the cheeks lined, as if experience itself signed the stone. These faces do not weaken the throne, they humanize it. A ruler can look tired and still be irresistible. This could imply a political message as much as an artistic one. The king is a seasoned caretaker who has learned the cost of calm. Southward, the river tightens into rock and rapid at the first cataract. Cataract meaning a stretch of rocky whitewater that breaks a boatman's rhythm. Beyond in Nubia, gold gleams in river bends and as desert hills. Senwosret III pushes Egypt's boundary deep into this corridor and binds it with a chain of forts, Buhen, Semna, Uronati, Kuma, Shalfak, each a small city of walls, ramps for archers, storerooms, wells and barracks. Think of a fortress as a lock on the river. Whoever holds it controls passage, taxes and safety. Boundary inscriptions here speak plainly of order, how high the Nile may rise before traders pass toll-free, how far officials pursue raiders across the desert. The language feels used, not ceremonial. You can hear officers reading it to each other in the shade of a gate. Traffic and water management improve in step. Crews dredge shoals, clear boulder-choked channels near the cataracts, and keep towpaths sound so haulers can pull boats upstream when the wind fails. Elsewhere, the Bar Youssef. Joseph's Canal, the natural branch that feeds the Fayum, benefits from renewed dikes and regulators under Middle Kingdom kings, most dramatically under Amenemhat III a little later, who turns the Fayum into a green basin of fields and fisheries. Senwosret III's reign sits in the middle of this hydraulic habit, the crown watching water as closely as it watches borders. It's the same idea in two elements, river and frontier, kept steady by measurement and will. Gold and stone feed the workshops, expeditions set out for quarry faces at Wadi Hammamat, desert roads crackle under donkey loads of grey waki and granite. In the north, jewellery houses learn to mist metal with delicacy. Filigree fine as breath, inlays of lapis and carnelian that catch lamplight like trapped sunrise. Woodworkers hinge boxes so smoothly the lids sigh shut. Craftsmen write names inside rings and seal amulets with prayers. The personal scale of beauty returns without letting go of grandeur. At the village level, you feel the state now as a steady hand rather than a distant shout. A tax official. Scribe, that's a literate administrator with a reed brush, sits in the shade to hear a widow's complaint about a boundary marker moved overnight. A local storehouse issues barley to a farmer who lost an ox in the flood. A patrol from the fortress circuit escorts traders downriver through waters known for ambush. None of this is dramatic, all of it adds up. The promise is not perfection, it is predictability. Art learns a softer clarity. Tomb scenes still show herds and fields, but the faces look more individual. Shoulders slope a little, hands rest on one another, as if bodies have weight and emotion. Statues of Senwosret III repeat the same lined, thinking countenance, not weary so much as awake. Based on the spread of this style into noble tombs, we can assume people wanted to be remembered as themselves, useful, flawed, particular, under a sky that also promised eternity. And of course the river remains the metronome. When the water rises to the 8th or 9th mark on the Nilometer steps, mouths relax. When it hesitates below the 5th, the whole country leans forward and listens. Priests pour libations, that's water or beer offered to a god. At dawn in the temple courts asking for the right measure. Scribes record heights with patience, then send their notes down the chain where numbers become grain and grain becomes time. Order in the Middle Kingdom is not a statue, it is a schedule. By the century's end, Egypt stands renewed. Forts holding the southern door, canals and cleared channels keeping boats in motion, granaries steadying the table, and literature teaching the next generation to speak wisely. The kings are stern, yes, but their sternness is domestic, the way an elder steadies a household after a long, anxious night. When evening comes and wind combs the barley, you can almost hear what the art is saying with lined eyes and thoughtful mouths. The state will be strong, and it will also care. Not every year is easy. Some floods still falter, some officials fail their duty, but the frame holds. And as lamps are lit along the river, a reader leans over a page and copies a line he knows by heart, about justice that listens, about the poor who find a voice. And he does not rush. In that unhurried script lies the Middle Kingdom's secret. Power learning to be patient so that people can sleep.